Colorado, and Colorado's a lot more drier, so it wasn't as bad there. But now we're back here with humidity and things blooming out, so we're going to see how it goes. Maybe it'll be all right. But we are certainly glad to be back and making some headway on getting into the community. We think we might have found a place to rent here in the community, and so we're going to check that out this week, and maybe that'll work out. So we're hoping to get out here as quick as we can, so we can be live among you too, not just come drive in from Killen every day. We're trying to live out here too. So be praying about that if you don't mind. We're trying to go forth with patience, but try to get out here as soon as we can too, trying to figure all that out. We're going to continue the lesson today talking about humility. And last week we wanted to see the essence of Jesus in his humility and how he was in the form of God, but he let that go and became one of us. And there's something that we learn in that possibly we as Christians, we might look over that sometimes because of the cultures and societies that we live in. And I think that's one of the things Paul was saying when he was telling us to transform our mind, not to take the form of the culture, but transform our mind. It's not always just the terrible things that we need to look out for. Lots of times it's just the mindset of a culture that's not fixed on the hope of heaven. That mindset's going to be different. And so humility, as we talk about this, this is one of the things where sometimes it gets a little personal. Because anytime our pride is kind of acting up, we don't hear very well, do we? But if you're teaching someone that's very humble, they hear what you have to say. But if we're teaching someone, or if someone's teaching me and I'm prideful, I don't hear what they have to say, because immediately with that becomes defensive walls. Trying to build up a defensive wall so that I'm not seen as weak, or so that I'm not seen as wrong. That's what pride does for us. Humility is one of the main things to move forward with, or to keep progressing in, to understand Jesus and to understand Christianity. And if we miss humility, then we miss so many things of what Jesus was trying to teach. Today, we're going to continue the second part of last week. So, humility as it relates to others. So last week, as it relates to others, we would see how Jesus related to us and how we're going to learn from the essence of who Christ is. But now, today, we're going to get more into application. And these applications, we're going to briefly mention several things in one lesson. And all of these can be so much more study and even so much more lessons for another day. And I'm going to briefly mention some of those things. But I'm going to start out, again, you may have noticed the scripture reading today is the same as it was last week, and it'll be one more week at least. All focused on Philippians chapter 2, but today we'll be jumping around several places after that. But I'm going to start out by reading Philippians chapter 2 again, and I'm going to start reading in verse 3. So if you want to follow on Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 3, and I'm going to read down through 8. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So understanding this, when you consider yourself a follower of Jesus, so just real quick in your mind, you can ask yourself, do I consider myself a follower of Jesus? And if you answer yes, then ask this, why? Now there will be a few things that you would immediately go to. You would say, well, because I've been baptized, which is true. You would say, because I go to church, which is true. Those are all things that followers of Jesus do. But I think one of the things we miss sometimes, one of the main things, is that being a follower of Jesus is becoming like Jesus. Not just something I do one time or the other, but becoming like Jesus all throughout life. And that's hard. And I don't mean that we will ever be just like Jesus. I don't mean that we will ever be perfection. I'm not saying that. But our goal is to show Jesus to the world. Not just tell the world about Jesus, but to show Jesus to the world. So if anybody comes up to you and tries to teach you something, but they don't do that themselves, you don't want to listen to that, do you? So if we come and try to teach the world about Jesus, but we don't live like Jesus, they're not going to want to listen. And Paul says this very thing. Have this attitude in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. So that makes sense. Okay, I need to have the same attitude as Christ. And then he immediately says something that just blows us away. He existed in the form of God, and he let every bit of that go. And the way this one says it is he emptied himself. And like I said last week, my Bible says, a little note down underneath it, he laid aside his privileges. And this is where it gets hard. Jesus, we are to become like Jesus. We're to have the same attitude in ourselves as Jesus' followers as Jesus did. And then Paul immediately says, here's what Jesus did. So you have the same attitude as Jesus. Here's what he did. He existed in the form of God. He laid aside his privilege. So we have to ask ourselves, are we supposed to lay aside our privileges just like Jesus did? You see, that comes along with being a Christian. That's being Jesus to the world. Laying aside our privileges. But for us, it takes a lot of humility to really grasp this. To grasp that I'm supposed to lay aside my privileges. I'm supposed to empty myself. So I want us to see this in another example of Jesus as we move into our application. Turn to John chapter 13, if you will. John chapter 13. I want you to see a really interesting thing is the way the writer John says it. So John chapter 13, and I just want to tell you, I read this the other day. So this past week, a certain day was going to be somewhat stressful. And I sat down that morning and I read John 13:14. And I mean, it just made so much difference. Not because I read it, but because of what it said. And it says that God is with me. And so that kind of takes away most of the fears that we have about anything. That God is with me. But listen to what it says in John 13, starting with verse 1. I'm just going to read just a very few verses. But I'm going to set this up and let you see what's happening. The writer here is going to tell you what's going on when he's about to make a point. So he's going to say, knowing that, knowing that, knowing that. So Jesus, knowing this, is about to do something. Now here he goes. John 13, starting verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, and that he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, the devil, having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God. Stop there. I want us to all get in our mind what the writer John just said about Jesus. Jesus, knowing that God had given all things into his hands. Some say, giving him all authority. So, Jesus, with the knowledge that God had just handed over to him all authority, it's all in your hands, Jesus. What are you going to do? You have all authority. It's all up to you. Here it is. Now notice what the writer says. He got up from supper, laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet. Is that not amazing? I mean, that just gives me chills reading it. God had given everything into Jesus' hands, and immediately he got up, laid aside his garment, put on a towel, and got down on his knees and started washing the feet of other men. That's what he did with all his power. He served people. He took on the form of a servant. When you would come into a house at that time, you would have a servant that would give you water to wash your feet. Sometimes they would even wash your feet. Jesus, their leader, God had given all things into his hands. Notice how it said he laid aside his garment. He got on his knees and he started washing their feet. Humility. Jesus is teaching the very men following him humility. And then he goes on to explain it. It says, so he came to Simon Peter, and Simon said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered and said, what I do you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter. And Peter said, never shall you wash my feet. Jesus answered, if I do not wash you, you have no part with me. And Simon Peter said to him, Lord, then wash not only my feet, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, he who has bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. You are clean, but not all of you. For he knew the one who was betraying him. For this reason he said, not all of you are clean. So when he had washed their feet, he taken his garments and reclined at the table. Again he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? Isn't this awesome? Wouldn't you want to be there? I mean, Jesus just made them real uncomfortable. Can you imagine all the apostles when Jesus is going around washing each other's feet, how uncomfortable they are? They're looking at each other. You know, like, should I get up and start washing people's feet, or what do I do? He took the time to wash everybody's feet, and then he sat down and said, do you know what I've just done? He wants them to understand. So here's what he says. You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord and teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. Is that not amazing? You see, one of the things that's hard in this life is knowing the difference between humility and confidence. Lots of times, many leaders, when they take on that leadership, they lose humility. Jesus didn't do that. In fact, he had all authority given to him, and immediately he got up and got on his knees and started washing people's feet. So many times, things that we are called to do as Christians, if we think that's a little beneath me, it's not. Whatever it is, it's not. You see, many times as a Christian, and here's the part where it gets hard, we're called upon, as it said, he laid aside his privilege, and then he laid aside his garments. We're called upon to lay aside some things that the world would tell you don't need to lay aside. We're called to lay aside our pride. Now that's easy. We all think, yeah, I should lay aside our pride. We're called to lay aside our rights. Now there's where it hurts. There's where when you say that, even when I say it now, I start thinking, uh-oh, what are some of the people hearing? And is this going to make some people upset? I'm an American. You don't tell me to lay aside my rights. But we are. Jesus never came to any of the people teaching, all right, here I am, the Messiah. It's time to get our rights back and kick out the Romans. He said, that's not my kingdom. In fact, you're going to live among these people, and you're going to serve them, and you're going to love them. That's how they're going to know that you're my disciples. And our example is not from someone who just laid aside his earthly rights. He laid aside existing in the form of God. He just let it go. That's who we're called to be. And then thirdly, lay aside our expectations of other people. Now this is hard too. Lay aside our expectations of other people. And here's why I say that. As a Christian, and as we are a follower of Christ, we learn about something about love that the world may not tell you. The world will not tell you. See, Jesus, what we learn from Jesus is that we decide to love people not based on how they treat us. So we don't just love people based on what they do to us or for us. That's not agape love. That's not the love of Christ. Christ loved people no matter how they treated him. He proved it in his death for them. And we're taught to love the world that way. Not based on how they treat us, but based on that God wants them to be loved. And we are now Jesus to the world. And it's hard to do that when we have expectations laid upon other people, so that if you do not meet those expectations, you do not deserve my love or my honor. This is where it gets hard. This is the essence of Christianity. And so I know the things that go on in our minds when we start talking about this. Andy, what you're talking about doesn't work. That's kind of what enters my mind when I start thinking through these things. A society can't function that way. And you know what? You might be right. A society can't function that way. And another thought, another person pointed out, if everybody acted that way, then it wouldn't work. If everybody acted like Jesus, then you'd get taken advantage of. And that's not true. Because if everybody acted like Jesus, it would all be love, which is what it's going to be one day. But what we've got to realize is right now we're living in a time where we can act like we're already in heaven, but we're living in a place where it's not completely there yet. So we have the Father, the Son, the Spirit, all dwelling inside us, saying, you know who wins in the end. You know how this turns out. You have hope. You have salvation. Live like that. But there's lots of the world that don't have that hope. They don't have that salvation. They don't know what you know. They don't have what you have. But you living it among them will help more of them to understand it. But if we say we have the hope, but we live like there's no tomorrow. Like, I got to survive. I got to promote myself. I got to live. I got to demand my rights. I got to make sure this society keeps going how it's supposed to go. Jesus comes and says, no, you're going to live within this society, but they're going to see something completely different out of you. Just like Jesus did. He came and lived within a society that told one thing, and he lived completely different. And much of the world would say, well, yeah, you see how it turned out for Jesus. That wasn't good, was it? That's what lots of the world would say. Here's how it turned out for Jesus. He got spat on, he got ridiculed, he got mocked, he got ran out of town, and he got killed on the cross. So the world would look at that and say, look at the outcome, that's not the good path. Well, we know something different. We know all of that was leading up to a point, to a goal, to the end of pleasing God. And so, I will stop there with this. This is a whole other talk for another time. But what we need to understand, after we read from Matthew 10, is that we need to let go of many of our expectations, many of our rights, and all of our pride. Now let's read Matthew 10, and that'll clarify just a little bit more before we jump into the applications. Matthew 10:25 is where we'll be. Thought I had it marked. Let me get there real quick. Matthew 10:25 is where we're going to start. And just notice what he says to his followers. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above his master. It is enough for the disciple that he become like his teacher, and the slave like his master. If they call the head of the house Beelzebub, how much more will they malign the members of his household? Therefore do not fear them, for there is nothing concealed that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. What I tell you in the darkness, speak in the light. What you hear whispered in your ear, proclaim upon the housetops. Do not fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a cent, and yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father? But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So do not fear, you are more valuable than many sparrows. So what Jesus is saying here is, don't live your life in the fear of other people. Live your life in the fear of God. And think about that word fear. In other words, respect. Don't live your life respecting the other person, or wanting their respect or wanting their praise. Don't live your life based on that. Live your life based on this. And it's because you live it. But notice what he said before that. Don't expect to be treated better than I am treated. That's what Jesus says. If they call the head of the household Beelzebub, how much more are they going to malign you? But I have to ask you that question now. Do you go through life expecting a certain treatment from other people? Do you think you deserve a certain treatment from other people? Jesus says to his followers, don't expect to be treated better than I'm treated. That's hard. And there was again, well, Andy, if there's no expectation of behavior, how does a society exist? And I understand that. I understand that thought, and there's a whole lot of thinking that can go on in this. But I'll leave it at this. We are living in a society that is based on and lives by those expectations. And we will continue to live in that society. And we are a part of that society. That's where we're called to stand out. So when you live in that society that exists on those expectations, and we humble ourselves and love people even if they don't meet those expectations, Jesus is glorified. That's who we're called to be. So how does that apply to our relationships? Well, I'm glad you asked. So, few categories I just want to say. One is what I'm going to call outsiders, and one is co-workers, and then in the church, and then families. And like I said, I'll hit these kind of briefly, but you could go into a lot more study on these later on. Just understanding these things. Outsiders and co-workers, and in the church and families. So how does humility affect your relationships with outsiders? How does your humility affect your relationship with co-workers, the people you're around lots during the day? How does humility affect your relationship with us, the church? And how does humility affect your relationship with the one sitting right beside you right now, your family? Your family that you live in a house with. Because that's the hardest sometimes. So outsiders, I'm going to give a definition of that. People that you encounter for our society, for our culture, people that you encounter from time to time in restaurants, in stores, in town. And so you interact with these people, but you don't know their background, you don't know their story, you don't know their beliefs. So I'm going to call that outsiders. Paul might have had a little bit different definition when he talks about them in Colossians. So he would say outsiders, probably meaning those that don't believe the way you do. Those, you're the church, there's a whole lot of people who are Jews that don't agree with, and a whole lot of people that Gentiles that don't agree with us. Live among those outsiders. But for our society, our culture, I just want to see, we will come into contact with many people throughout the course of a week or a month that we don't really see them a lot, so we don't know their background or their story. We don't know who they are, or if they're Christians or not. We don't know any of that stuff. How does humility affect our relationship with those people? In Colossians 4, if you'll turn to Colossians, we're going to be flipping back and forth from Colossians to Ephesians. It's just a few pages in your Bible. So turn to Colossians chapter 4. I'm going to read, starting in verse 4, chapter 4, I'm going to start reading just 5 and 6. Conduct yourselves with wisdom toward outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. So, think about that. The people you come in contact Maybe riding down the road, somebody cuts you off. Maybe you go to a restaurant, you order some food, and the waiter or waitress is not really focused on you, or filling up your glass, or getting your order right. You come in contact with people. If you go to a store and the customer service is not really great, how do we interact with those people? If I go to a restaurant, sit down and say, with this thought, all right, I have expectations of this person. If they don't meet my expectations, I will treat them differently. Now I know, many of you are thinking, well, if that business doesn't do good, customer service, they're not going to make it. I know all that. I'm talking about you and that person in that moment. If your waiter or waitress comes in and they're just not doing a good job, or they bring your food wrong, our response in that moment says a whole lot about how we value Jesus. Because if I have expectations of that person to get everything right, and this is my hard-earned money, and if I'm going to come and give it to you, you need to serve me and get everything right. If that's my attitude, that's not speaking very highly of a Jesus follower. But if I'm sitting there and things aren't going right, and you can tell the person serving is not really doing a good job, if I just have this thought, you know what? There's people in the world that hope they get one meal of rice and beans today. There's lots of children that hope they get a bowl of beans and many more. And all of a sudden, any pride, any expectation should just fall apart. I say, I can't believe God has me in a place where I have enough money where I can go out to eat. And I can sit here and enjoy this meal. And I tell you what, that waiter or waitress may have something going on in their life that's making it really hard for them to be at work today. And so I'm going to do this. I'm going to try to be a joy and a blessing to that person, no matter how they treat me or what my food tastes like. I just want to be a joy and a blessing to that person. I want to encourage that person. I'm going to pray for that person. Imagine if we have that attitude. If we get rid of our pride and our expectations, and we just try to be a servant everywhere we go. Even in a restaurant where people are serving us. We just say, how can I serve them? Because remember, all of this goes back to Jesus. God giving all things into his hands, he put on a towel. And he washed feet. So when we're among people that don't have our best interest at hand, in town, on the road, in restaurants, those outsiders, be a servant to those people. In humility, love those people. Casting off those expectations. Try to serve the people you're around. I guarantee you it will make a difference. Because people know what's going on. They know if they're not doing a good job. They know that. And they're usually treated that way because they're not doing a good job. And it just makes it worse. And if someday they're doing something bad and not focusing, you just say, how can I help you? How can I serve you? How can I love you? What can I pray for? It just hit them like a ton of bricks. Just thank you. I went to eat with a man one time, and his waiter came, was doing some stuff, and he just said, we're about to pray for our food. Is there anything we can pray for in your family? And it shocked her. I said, well, yes. She opened up about something that's going on in her life that we would have never known about if we had just had the expectations that she's there to meet our needs. He was there to serve her. That's what a Christian is. Every time we go to eat, that's what a Christian is. Every time we drive down the road, every time we go into a store, every time we function in society, we're there to serve and love. That comes from humility. Getting rid of our pride and our expectations. Moving on to number 2. In co-workers, in the workplace. So let's go to Ephesians chapter 6. A little bit of explaining to do with this one. Ephesians chapter 6, we're going to read 5 through 9. And if you want to mark these down with these headings and go back and look at them later, that might be a good idea. But Ephesians chapter 6, 5 through 9. Now this is where Paul is talking about slaves and masters. So I'm going to read it, then a brief explanation about that and how it applies to the workplace. So Ephesians chapter 6, 5 through 9. Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, as to Christ, not by way of eye service, as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With good will, render service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. And masters, do the same thing to them, and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. Now, quick explanation and talk about this for a second. This is Paul dealing with a really hard thing. And he's dealing with it with a certain mindset. So many people have said lots of stuff about Paul and how he discusses it. And they would say, well, why didn't Paul stand up against slavery? Why didn't Paul lead a rebellion against slavery? And it's a good question to ask. But I think what we see from Paul is a good thing that we can all learn. Is that there are many things in life that are going to be unfair. So this is not all about making things fair, but about how you live in the unfairness. And Paul says to slaves, so this is a weird thing now. The church is coming in and people are starting to believe. Now some masters and slaves are starting to believe together. This is interesting. So how are they going to deal with this? How are they going to deal with a whole societal system set up on this? Our country dealt with it too. Here's how Paul deals with it. He says, if you're a slave, be the best worker you can be. If you're a master, be really fair. Because that's what speaks highly of God. That's what he's talking about here. He's not saying, I think slavery is a good thing. He's saying, if you're in this situation, here's how you're going to live as Christ. Live like you're a slave to Christ, not to that person. And then to masters, treat them fairly because you also have a master. See, all of these things lead to getting rid of our humility. And so when we think about this in a workplace, if this would work in that completely unfair situation, now how does it work in your workplace, where you are? Because sometimes your boss probably demands a little too much of you. Or sometimes you might do something that somebody else gets credit for. Sometimes your coworkers might be having a bad day and things don't go well. Sometimes as leaders, you have to try to deal with people. You're trying to teach them, and they've got a little too much pride and they won't be taught. So how does humility help our relationships in our workplaces? So I asked someone who's a leader in a business about this, and he said humility allows for coworkers to be a really good team member. And that makes a lot of sense. He said because a business has one thing in mind to accomplish, and if everybody is a part of that, that helps that business to reach that goal. And that makes sense to it. Almost like Paul said in Philippians, be intent on one purpose. So we are as a church. So we understand co-workers from this point, it helps the business to be a good business. Because whenever we go and take on a job, or if you're in leadership, humility allows us to be good listeners. It allows us to be good learners. If I think I already know anything you've got to tell me, I'm probably not going to listen very well. Humility allows us to be good learners and good listeners, whether we're in leadership or not. It allows us to be a good teammate. And it also does another thing. It breaks down walls within your workplace. And so, if I'm working somewhere, and in that time people know that, well, if I try to tell Andy that he's doing this wrong, he's probably going to get upset. They're not really going to want to talk to me very much. If I try to critique him and tell him, you need to adjust this, or you're not doing this right, but he knows it's going to cause a big problem if you try to say something, it doesn't make a good worker. And you know what else it does? It makes it where that person's probably not going to share more deeper things about their life with me also. If they can't come to me with a simple thing that says you need to do this differently, they're not going to come to me and say, Andy, I got something going on in my life. Can you help me with it? So there's so much more going on than just being a good coworker. It leads to getting deeper with people when they see that we're humble. When they come to us and say, how about this? Or let's try this. Yeah, I've never thought about that way. Let's talk about it. Let's think about it. Or yeah, let's try that and see how that goes. Good idea. Good job. Being a servant at work. Whether you're a leader or just a worker, being a servant at work. Because that's who Jesus was. He was a servant. Now let's go on to the next one. In the church. And we'll hit these last two. Like I said, all this has got to be brief. But these last two in the church. So in Colossians, go back to Colossians chapter 3. I'm going to read 12 through 17. Colossians chapter 3, 12 through 17. Now if you notice, in Ephesians and Colossians, Paul's talking a whole lot about relationships. So here's what he says in chapter 3, 12 through 17. So as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another, and forgiving each other, whoever has a complaint against anyone. All right, stop there, and then we'll read one of the most important parts of it. But think about that within the church. Bearing with one another, forgiving each other, whoever has a complaint against anyone. Let it go. Now, does that mean we can't talk about differences? Yes, we can. But the main goal is I'm going to be humble and gentle and forgiving. If we all approach it that way, then we're going to get somewhere. If we approach it with, I'm going to say this and you need to listen, it usually doesn't work that way. That builds defensive walls. So bearing with one another, forgiving one another. Now listen to this. If you think sometimes, well, Andy, that person doesn't deserve forgiveness. Or, well, they're wrong. Any of that comes up, listen to what he says next. So he says, bearing with one another, forgiving each other, whoever has a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. That says it all right there, doesn't it? Just as the Lord forgave you. Did you deserve forgiveness from Jesus? No. Did I deserve forgiveness from Jesus? No. We did not deserve it, but He gave it. That's how we should forgive other people. Verse 14, beyond all these things, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, as indeed you are called in one body, and be thankful. Notice that. The peace of Christ rule in your heart. What that rule means, that's the authority in your heart. The peace of Christ. Because we're one body, and we do that through love. Now, I'm going to spend a very short time on that, because that's one of the things, even when we were talking about having the opportunity to come back and work with you, that's one of the things we were so excited about. Because it's one of the things we remember from being here, and also notice when we get back. Everybody here loves each other so much. And it's just so evident. Everybody takes care of each other, loves each other. It's awesome. And we want to come and learn from you even in that way. But the next one, what I'm going to end on, it's harder sometimes, I think. Showing humility with the people in your house. Now it seems on the surface, well, that would be the easiest because that's the ones that I'm closest to and love the most. Sometimes that's the hardest. Sometimes that's where we put more expectations upon my wife, or expectations from a wife to a husband, or expectations of children. That's where we build up lots of expectations, and it's hard. So how do you deal with this when you're supposed to discipline your children? So you have to have expectations. How does all this work together? It does. It's hard, and it takes lots of prayer, lots of time trying to figure it out. But I want to just say this about it. Learning from what Paul says in Ephesians, and we'll read from that. The expectations that we have of each other, I understand them. And I understand them because I have expectations of my wife, and my wife has expectations of me. And when those aren't met, it's okay to talk about those. Here's the question. If my wife does not meet my expectations, should that cause me to treat her differently? If I don't meet my wife's expectations, should that cause her to treat me differently? Should that cause her to love me less? to ask it this way. Your children, do they always meet your expectations? No. Do you stop loving them? No. Now I know that's different, but I just want to get that concept in our head. I do not need to react to everything every time I'm in our house with my wife based on how she's treating me. And she doesn't need to react on me based on how I'm treating her. If that's the case, we're constantly going to be waiting to see what the other person does to see how I'm going to treat them. And that's what we do lots of times. But in humility, if we take on the mind of a servant in our households, if I see myself as a servant of my wife, I'm here to meet her needs. I'm here to lift her up. I'm here to encourage her. Not based on how she treats me, but because God wants me to. It changes it. And many people in society, and it does happen, would say, well, that will get you walked all over. That's just being naive. Those kind of thoughts will come up lots of times. And yes, lots of times in society, the one who seems to take the weaker path will be taken advantage of. Just like Jesus was. Jesus was taken advantage of because he laid aside his privileges. And there are many times in our households with our husbands or their wives when I'm not doing what I should. I'm not speaking with the tone I should. I'm not being the husband I should. And there will be many times when wives are not getting it just right too. But if we have the mind and the attitude of servants to our husbands and wives, then that means whatever she does today, I'm going to love her and serve her, encourage her, and build her up. If we can constantly try to have that attitude, letting go of our expectations, laying aside our expectations, I'm going to love her anyways. She's going to love me anyways. And not just love like, yeah, I always love them. I mean, love. Like, want to be with them, want to serve them, want to make them happy. Love that is evident in your behavior, in your talk. If we can both try to put those expectations on, then it no longer becomes, well, she's not meeting my needs. It becomes, how can I meet her needs more every day? And for the wife, how can I meet his needs more every day? And so it's not a, I need this from you, I need this from you. It's what can I give you? What can I give you? How can I serve you? That makes much of God. That says to the world, this is how people live when they truly love each other. That says to the world, I want that. I want a life like that. How can I have it? You say, it's all about Jesus. One day, everybody's going to live this way. But right now, we're in a society that doesn't, but you can still live that way. So husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Wives, respect your husbands. That's what Paul says. And the reason he says that is because he knows God made us with those needs. Men, one of the best things that helps us feel like who we're supposed to be is if we have respect for our wives. It does me. That may sound prideful, but if I know my wife honors me and respects me and loves me, it makes me want to be better. And wives, if you know your husband just really cares about you and loves you, just wants to be kind to you and help you, doesn't it make you feel better and want to be better? That's what Paul says. Wives, respect your husbands. Husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church. Notice what Christ did for the church. He took the blame when he was not guilty. Christ took the blame when he is not guilty and gave himself for the church. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. You've got to get rid of a lot of pride before we get to that point. But that's who we're called to be. And children, how can you use humility to serve your parents? And that's what you're taught to. You're taught to be humble And as you're trying to be humble with each other, with brothers and sisters, you may not always get to have that toy you want or that candy, or there might not be enough to share. And if your attitude is, well, I would rather you have it than me, I want you to be the one that's lifted up, that's edified. I want to serve you. Children, if you have this attitude with each other and with your parents, how can I serve my mom and daddy? How can I do the dishes for them one night so mommy can just sit down and have an enjoyable time? Can I go cut the grass so my dad don't have to do it? How can I serve my parents? Because that's who Jesus was. He was a servant. And so humility allows us to see ourselves as Jesus, a servant. Not perfect like Jesus, but a servant like Jesus. And that's how we can learn Jesus from our children. Children can learn Jesus from parents, by us being servants. So I want to end with that. And I want to challenge you this week to think about humility plays a role in your relationships with the people that you're going to be around this week. So in your homes, children, parents, husbands, wives, brothers, and sisters, ask yourself this and pray about it and ask God to help you see, how can you serve the people in your house? How can you be like Jesus to the people in your house? And when you go to work, how can you serve the people there so that you can be like Jesus to them? Whether what's happening to me is fair or not, you throw that out. How can I help? How can I serve? When you go eat lunch, how can you be a blessing to that waiter or waitress? When you go get a car tag, and you stand in line for an hour, how can I be a blessing to the people I'm standing in line with? How can I talk with them and share life with them? Wherever we are, how can we be a servant? That comes from humbling ourselves. We've learned that from Jesus. I want to encourage you to do those things. Look at the people in your lives this week and ask yourself, how can I be a servant to that person? And Hal's going to come and lead us in the song that he's mentioned. If you have any need of us from your family in any way that we can serve you or help you at this time, please come as we stand and sing.